Welcome to Conlang diachrony. We continue our series about building sound changes for our constructed languages. Today we'll be talking about some special assimilations. But first I'd like to do some follow-up on the previous video. Most of these points of follow-up are based on observations and feedback I received from Keras Saryan. So thank you for your feedback and help. The first is that I've been using some terminology that may be non-standard. For instance, when referring to non-geminant consonants, I use the term simplex. The standard term is singleton. Now this is a case where Trask, the source I'm using, seem to be using non-standard terminology. So I may need to do better to ensure that I'm using the proper terminology in the future. I also tend to be guilty of reader's pronunciation, where I pronounce a word incorrectly due to only having ever seen it in print. If you notice me doing that, let me know. The second is in regard to the phrase multiple types of lenition. I referred to some changes between Latin and Spanish where multiple types of lenition occurred. It's worth noting that these types of lenition are not occurring simultaneously, but diachronically are occurring one after the other. It's only when looking at it from a synchronic perspective that they appear to be occurring simultaneously. Also, throughout the previous videos, I have made references to irregular changes. It's worth noting that irregular changes likely don't happen at all. The only exception to this may be metathesis or some types of dissimilation, although I'm not really sure about dissimilation. All other instances of irregular change probably fall into one of the following categories. When a word gets grammaticalized, it will often undergo changes that the rest of the language doesn't undergo. Similarly, analogical leveling can cause changes that are otherwise irregular. In general, these changes that appear to be irregular are likely interacting with a prosodic system or morphology, rather than being purely irregular sound changes. The other possible sources of irregular sound change could be the result of dialect mixing or borrowing, where a form of the word is borrowed or brought in from a dialect where the change does not occur. It could also be the result of a sound change that is in the process of occurring, which hasn't necessarily happened to all words. Sound changes that are in the process of happening may not affect all words at the same speed, but will eventually spread to all words. There's also something to be said for simply saying that something is irregular because the context in which it occurs is so complicated that it's not worth figuring out. This is up to you as the conlanger to decide if you want to figure out the specific context for this kind of a change. And finally, some irregular changes are the result of some kind of spelling-influenced hypercorrection or other cultural reasons where people would revert back to a previous pronunciation of that word. I'm not entirely certain if this last one is actually a thing, but I'm fairly confident that this is a thing that happens, so your mileage may vary. I've also been guilty of some sloppy notation in some of my previous videos. Some examples are shown here. Finally, in the case study, I just want to be clear what I'm trying to do there. The case study examples are more about showing the process. In fact, in these videos, you might even think of it as brainstorming. These are not necessarily the final changes that I'm going to rely on, so some of the changes that I show might be bad changes. That's just the process that I go through as a conlanger, and you're getting a little bit of an inside look at it. With that follow-up out of the way, we can continue on discussing these special cases of assimilation. Looking back at the 4 operations you can perform on a segment, these will all fall under the change a segment operation, specifically assimilation, as the title of this video implies. These are all common enough assimilations that they have their own name and are worth discussing separately on their own. The first of these operations we'll discuss is palatalization, which may be one of the most well-known of these special assimilations. This occurs when the tongue moves closer towards the palate, whether that's moving a sound further forward in the mouth, such as with velars, or moving a sound further back in the mouth, as with coronal sounds. This is usually assimilation to a following palatal sound, most often I or other front vocalic sounds, as can be seen in these examples. Other times, the palatalization appears to be more spontaneous. That is, there isn't always an obvious palatal sound that is causing the change. That can be seen in these examples. Notice that there may still be particular environments in which it occurs, but it's not as obvious why it becomes palatal. Palatalized consonants can also affect nearby vocalic sounds, as can be seen in this example from pre-Greek to Attica Greek, with an intermediate palatalization of the N. You may think that this looks like a sort of metathesis, and this is in fact one of the ways that metathesis may occur. More on that in a later video. Palatalization is often accompanied by affrication. Sometimes the segment that is palatalized in this way will later lose its palatalization but retain the affrication, and so palatalization can be one source of lenition. The examples here show this process. Another fairly common, although perhaps less well known and less obvious process is velarization. This is where the tongue moves towards the velum. Usually this involves moving towards the back of the mouth. Most often this occurs as assimilation to a following velar or back sound, most often before back vowels or velar consonants. It also often occurs word finally. The examples here show where it happens. Notice that in a language like English, this is more of an allophonic variation. Another common process, and one that is often more allophonic than phonemic, is nasalization. This most often occurs with vowels, and they assimilate to a following nasal sound. Sometimes the nasal itself is lost in the process. This would be an example then of fusion. This can be seen in these examples. The final one that we'll discuss in depth is spirantization, also called fricativization. This is where stops or affricates become spirants. Stops will either go directly to fricative or will acquire a spirant release. This can be seen in various forms in this example. Affricates, on the other hand, will decomplexify into fricatives, as can be seen in these examples. Basically, spirantization is the process of lenition. There are several other processes that are worth mentioning because they have special names. Labialization is the process of rounding, usually triggered by a round vowel or a labial consonant. Retroflexion is the process of becoming a retroflex consonant. Dentalization is the process of coronals becoming more dental in the mouth. Glottalization refers to the various ways that a sound might have a glottal release. Rhoticism is the assimilation of a sound to a rhotic consonant, and lambdacism is the assimilation of a sound to a lateral consonant. These names come from the Greek names of the letters producing those sounds. I just have two concluding unscientific observations. The first is that palatalization seems to be the most common of these, at least phonemically speaking, whereas most of the other ones will occur with fair regularity, but as allophonic variation. So what are the best ways to apply this to conlanging? For our bread and butter, we have palatalization. Now this can be with or without affrication, and may possibly lose the palatalization after affrication. I would also throw nasalization under the bread and butter, although mostly it'll be as an allophonic process. The meat and potatoes are really all the rest. None of these is so rare or so unusual that it wouldn't fit in just about any conlang, and all of them can be used to make more interesting conlang histories. These assimilations are especially useful for creating new series of sounds, as in the case of palatalization, or creating interesting allophonic variation. So let's turn to our case study, starting with target lang. Reminder, this is our target phonology. Notice, especially relevant for this video, that our target phonology is going to have a palatal series, or at least a palatal adjacent series. And this is our proto-lang phonology. It's a fairly basic and bare-bones phonology, but that allows us plenty of opportunity to grow and apply sound changes too. So, we know that we're going to need a palatal series. Palatalization is the built-in way of doing it. Perhaps we have velars go to palatal before a front vowel, so timu becomes chimu. Remember that we had vowel assimilation earlier. Let's also add in a case of rhoticism. Specifically, S becomes R intervocalically. So asi would become eri. We may want to use some of the other stuff for allophonic variation, but I'd like to see what we end up with before I go into that too much. So let's move on to freelang. For freelang, I'd like to also do palatalization, but I'd like it to affect every consonant. Every consonant becomes palatalized before a front vowel or before a front glide. For example, pima would become kima. I may also add affrication and depalatalization to some of the consonants when they are palatalized, but I'm not sure exactly what direction I want to take that yet, so we'll see what sounds we've ended up with before going back and adding those in. I think I'd also like to add in velarization, where a consonant becomes velarized before a back vowel, or W, or a velar. For example, puma would become pluma. This would create a variation, similar to that found in Irish, between broad and slender consonants. I think we could also add nasalization in, where we would have a rule that says that nasal codas disappear while nasalizing the vowel that they are accompanied with. So banta would become banta. Again, we might do a little bit more with the allophony later, but for now, these will be our major changes. These are some of the sources that I used in creating this video. In our next video, we're going to look at how to apply a lot of these similar changes to vowels, because vowels have kind of unique way of working. Looking down the road a little bit, the next couple of videos will continue to discuss specific types of sound changes, and then after that I'm going to stop and take stock of where we're at. That'll be a chance for us to go through and look at the sound changes I've already decided on for the two languages, and see which ones are reasonable and realistic and which ones might need to be finessed a little bit more. After that, we'll start looking at phonological processes and the way that all these different sound changes might interact with each other. That'll also include a discussion of ordering, as well as going back to some of the potential changes in this video that I decided not to delve into because I'd like to think about them a little bit more, and then go back and see what it looks like once we've arranged our sound changes. Until next time, happy conlanging.